The sound of shattering glass echoed down Interstate 95 that morning, a fiery collision, 3 dead, 1 trucker in handcuffs. He barely spoke English, yet somehow he held a California commercial driver's license. How did he get it? That single question ignited one of the most alarming investigations in modern American history. Federal agents soon discovered the driver wasn't an isolated case. He was part of something larger, an invisible network feeding unvetted foreign nationals into one of America's most critical industries. The trail led from the Florida crash site to the crowded streets of New York City, where the Chinese-American trucker organization operated from a nondescript Brooklyn office. What began as a traffic tragedy would explode into an intelligence firestorm spanning multiple states. Under President Donald Trump, the Department of Homeland Security ordered an immediate review. ICE agents traced fake documents, Mandarin language training videos, and suspicious money transfers originating from Hong Kong and mainland China. The evidence suggested that the crash was no accident. It was the tip of a carefully engineered infiltration. As the case deepened, investigators realized that thousands of commercial licenses had been issued to individuals with no proper testing, no residency proof, and no verifiable immigration records. Behind it all stood a network of front companies, employment agencies, and nonprofits whose smiling banners masked foreign interests. Strategically, this was no longer about fraud. It was about control, who moved America's goods, who accessed its energy corridors, and who stood behind the wheel of vehicles crossing defense supply routes. Analysts from Defense News and Jane's Defense Weekly warned that the scheme posed risks similar to cyber infiltration. It was a logistical breach hidden in plain sight. A single unvetted driver could become a weapon on wheels capable of striking refineries, power plants, or even military convoys. The implications echoed far beyond the United States. In Europe, DW reported that Moscow's own transport networks had been targeted by sleeper cells using civilian cover. In the Middle East, Al Jazeera drew parallels with covert supply routes between Iran and proxy militias. And in East Asia, Beijing's trade corridors and overseas influence campaigns mirrored the same pattern, leveraging commerce to extend reach, not just profits. But at home, the shock was personal. Families of the Florida victims demanded to know how federal systems failed so catastrophically. Trucking unions already battling driver shortages now faced accusations of complicity. ICE officers were flooded with tips while Congress held emergency hearings on the security of state licensing systems. As night fell over, Washington, one haunting question remained. If America's highways, its arteries of trade and survival, could be breached this easily, what else has already been infiltrated? Flashing sirens split the night across lower Manhattan. Canal Street, normally alive with tourists and counterfeit handbags, became the center of a federal operation that looked more like a counter-terror raid than a licensing bust. Dozens of ICE agents stormed a narrow Brooklyn office, shattering glass doors and hauling out boxes marked C-8 and training materials. Within hours, headlines blazed across the nation. ICE raid exposes Chinese trucking network. Inside the building, investigators found laptops loaded with Mandarin language tutorials, promising commercial driver's licenses in under 3 weeks. No tests, no interviews, no problem, one video declared. Behind the smiling instructors stood the logo of the Chinese-American Trucker Organization, a group that claimed to help Chinese migrants find honest work. But what ICE uncovered was something else entirely, a transnational system that blurred the line between employment aid and covert infiltration. Documents seized from the office revealed a paper trail stretching from New York to California and even into Texas. Thousands of names, license numbers, and payment records showed migrants, many who had crossed illegally from Mexico, receiving step-by-step guidance on how to falsify residency, memorize English answers for DMV tests, and bypass federal verification systems. At first glance, it resembled another fraudulent employment ring, but embedded within the organization's corporate filings was a web of connections that changed everything. The nonprofit's advisory board included individuals linked to the United Front Work Department, Beijing's global influence arm, the same entity cited by Reuters in reports on foreign lobbying and diaspora manipulation. The implications sent shockwaves through Washington. Under Trump's direct orders, Homeland Security launched Operation Twin Shield, a coordinated crackdown uniting ICE, FBI, and Treasury investigators. Intelligence officials began to suspect the raid was not merely about illegal labor. It was about leverage, a hidden channel granting the Chinese Communist Party indirect access to America's logistics infrastructure. Strategic analysts compared it to hybrid warfare, the use of legal loopholes and social institutions as tools of power projection. Just as Russia had used mercenary logistics in Donbass and Iran had weaponized smuggling routes through Syria, Beijing seemed to be using America's own trade arteries as silent pressure points. Yet the danger wasn't theoretical. According to BBC News updates, over 1,000 unvetted truckers trained through CA-TO were already on US highways hauling goods for major corporations unaware of the network behind their drivers. Many were operating near ports, refineries, and military supply chains. Every mile driven by these individuals represented a risk to commerce, to safety, and to national sovereignty. For everyday Americans, the story struck a nerve. Truck stops, once seen as symbols of blue-collar pride, now felt like uncertain checkpoints of infiltration. The question echoing from Florida to New York was simple: how many more are out there? As dawn broke over the city skyline, federal trucks rolled away from Canal Street, carrying boxes of evidence. Inside those boxes lay the blueprint of a shadow economy, one that had quietly rewritten the rules of who gets to drive America forward. The raid was over, but the reckoning had just begun. Her name was Gang Hong, and to many in New York's immigrant business circles, she was a symbol of success, the woman who helped newcomers find opportunity behind the wheel of an American truck. But to ICE investigators, she became the face of something far more sinister. The trail from the Brooklyn raid led straight to Gang's door. Corporate filings, social media posts, and Reuters verified financial records revealed that she controlled both the Chinese-American trucker organization Cato and a second business called the Red Apple Employment Agency, both operating out of the same cramped Manhattan office. Together they formed the backbone of what agents now called a migration funnel. Under her leadership, Red Apple advertised across Mandarin language forums, promising work licenses and even border advice for those willing to pay. Many of these clients had entered through illegal crossings in Arizona and Texas, and within weeks they were enrolled in training schools that guaranteed commercial driver's licenses without formal instruction. ICE agents later confirmed that instructors were fluent only in Mandarin and that DMV tests were often taken under false identities. Gang was no ordinary recruiter. Before moving to the US, she had served on the American Shaanxi General Chamber of Commerce, an organization frequently mentioned in DW and The Guardian reports as part of Beijing's United Front Diaspora Outreach Network. Her connections extended into Chinese consular circles and US-based political fundraisers, where she was often photographed beneath red banners praising cooperation with the motherland. For national security analysts, these weren't just coincidences. They represented a pattern: the use of soft power networks to shape perceptions, influence local politics, and create logistical channels that could serve dual purposes: economic opportunity on the surface, strategic leverage beneath. A classified defense news briefing in late 2024 described Gang's operations as civil-military gray zones where commercial infrastructure could double as influence architecture. The report compared her network's methods to those of Chinese maritime logistics hubs in Sri Lanka and Djibouti, civilian on paper, strategic in practice. As Trump's administration tightened restrictions on foreign funding and NGO activities, Gang's empire began to crumble. Agents found encrypted WeChat groups where she instructed migrants on avoiding ICE checkpoints and shared real-time alerts when raids were imminent. Some posts even used coded language that investigators later linked to contacts in mainland China. Meanwhile, similar infiltration tactics were surfacing abroad. In Ukraine, Russian-backed militias used local business fronts to move fuel and supplies under civilian covers, tactics eerily similar to what US investigators now suspected in the trucking industry. In the Middle East, Iran's Revolutionary Guard had embedded operatives into commercial trade routes disguised as logistics contractors. Across Asia, Beijing's Belt and Road corridors blurred civilian and military boundaries with the same precision. The global pattern was undeniable: control infrastructure and you control movement and you control power. But beneath the geopolitics lay a human story: drivers who thought they were buying a future, not smuggling influence. Many of the migrants ICE later detained confessed they had no idea their training schools were part of a political network. They came chasing the American dream and found themselves entangled in a geopolitical chessboard. As Gang Hang was led away in handcuffs outside her Manhattan apartment, she told reporters, "I only help people work." But by then, the question had shifted. Was she helping them or helping Beijing? And if America's labor pipelines could be manipulated from afar, how many other industries were already compromised? The raid's aftermath rippled through Washington like an electric shock. Files seized from Gang Hang's offices didn't just reveal a trucking scandal, they exposed a constellation of nonprofit civic councils and community organizations quietly overlapping with one another. Their names sounded harmless: the Chinese American Planning Council, Friends of Cathay Harmony Education Fund. But when Homeland Security analysts overlaid donor lists and board memberships, the picture grew alarming. According to a BBC investigation published in early 2025, several of these groups received millions in federal and state grants money intended for immigrant assistance, workforce training, and language outreach. Yet surveillance footage obtained by ICE painted a different story: secret workshops where activists coached illegal migrants on how to evade ICE, falsify employment histories, and exploit sanctuary policies in states like New York and California. The most shocking discovery came from the Chinese American Planning Council (CPC), the largest taxpayer-funded Chinese American NGO in New York. In a hidden camera video aired by Reuters and Al Jazeera, CPC staff members could be heard instructing attendees to hide in community centers and use coded text alerts during federal enforcement actions. Some of the funding Treasury analysts later revealed traced back to Chinese state-linked banks, a direct financial overlap that blurred the line between cultural outreach and foreign interference. Homeland Security Chairman Mark Green called the revelation deeply troubling. President Trump demanded an emergency review of all federal grants tied to foreign-influenced NGOs, declaring taxpayer dollars will never again fund organizations undermining our own border laws. For national security officials, the issue went far beyond immigration. It was about network warfare, the creation of parallel institutions that quietly eroded the credibility of U.S. enforcement. A DW report described it as a civilian cloak for strategic influence, noting that similar models had emerged in Germany, where Chinese community groups were caught channeling political donations to municipal campaigns sympathetic to Beijing's trade agenda. Analysts from Jane's Defense Weekly noted an eerie parallel between these civic fronts and Russia's humanitarian NGOs operating in occupied Ukrainian regions groups that distributed aid while collecting intelligence for military use. The pattern they warned was global, the blending of soft power civil institutions and economic leverage to destabilize from within. But beyond geopolitics were real lives. Many migrants at these CPC seminars were desperate, believing these organizations offered legal help, not entrapment. One young woman interviewed by The Guardian said she crossed the border thinking she would become a licensed driver in 6 weeks. Instead, she was coached to forge residency documents and threatened with deportation if she refused. Meanwhile, in Texas and Arizona, ICE officers reported new surges of Chinese nationals arriving through cartel-controlled routes once dominated by Central American smugglers. The border, once thought to separate national policy from global strategy, was dissolving into a theater of influence. Every detail, every workshop, every payment, every manipulated migrant pointed to a chilling truth: America's institutions were being used to hollow out their own enforcement from the inside. As Senate hearings intensified, one senator asked the question now hanging over every agency: when your enemy can build their networks inside your laws, how do you defend democracy without destroying its freedoms? They called it Operation Twin Shield, the most expansive homeland infiltration probe since the Cold War. Its mission: dismantle the invisible infrastructure that allowed unvetted migrants, forged documents, and foreign influence to penetrate the American heartland. Launched in the early months of 2025, the operation united ICE, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security under one command structure. President Trump's directive was blunt: no sanctuary for foreign infiltration, not in our ports, not on our highways, not in our institutions. What followed was a nationwide crackdown spanning 10 states, from the trucking depots of California to the freight corridors of Pennsylvania. Agents discovered that the fraudulent licensing system wasn't isolated to New York. In Florida, 8 DMV employees were arrested for selling over 1,000 commercial driver's licenses to illegal migrants. No tests, no background checks, no proof of residency. In Illinois, investigators seized 20,000 counterfeit IDs traced to Hong Kong. By summer, the network's reach had stretched from the East Coast to the Mexican border, feeding into what analysts at Defense News described as a logistics shadow state hidden within America's legitimate transport economy. At the center of it all stood another name: Wang Yibing, president of the Taishan Women's Association of New York, a figure long celebrated for cultural diplomacy. But FBI agents soon discovered her association's financial records tied to accounts held by the Bank of China and the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, ICBC. Wang's group had sponsored pro-Beijing rallies during Taiwan's presidential transit, and now investigators alleged it also funneled money to training programs assisting undocumented truckers. When ICE and FBI agents surrounded her Queens residence at dawn, neighbors watched as Wang was led away in handcuffs. Her attorney called it political theater, but for Homeland Security, it was proof that the same networks shaping diaspora narratives were embedding within America's supply chain. International parallels grew unavoidable. In Eastern Europe, DW reported Russian intelligence using shipping companies as espionage covers along NATO supply lines. In the Middle East, Al Jazeera revealed Iran's IRGC-backed transport firms disguising arms convoys as aid shipments to Syria and Lebanon. And in Asia, Reuters chronicled China's dual-use logistics civilian ports and trucking companies strategically positioned to serve both commerce and defense. The pattern was unmistakable. Modern power no longer relied solely on armies, but on access, who moves goods, who controls routes, who knows where America's critical arteries lead. For the United States, that realization hit hard. Trucking was the bloodstream of its economy, moving food, medicine, fuel, and military components. And now the same system had become a vector for infiltration. ICE Director Troy Miller described the discovery as a blueprint for soft sabotage. But the human toll was harder to ignore. Families of crash victims demanded answers. Migrant drivers who'd been promised opportunity now faced deportation or imprisonment. Some cooperated with investigators, exposing coaching sessions run by employment agencies that doubled as political outreach fronts. Operation Twin Shield was more than enforcement. It was a mirror held up to America's vulnerabilities. The nation that built its strength on openness was now forced to question whether openness itself had become the breach. By autumn, hundreds of licenses were revoked, dozens of bank accounts frozen, and multiple NGOs placed under Treasury review for foreign agent compliance. Yet amid the triumph, an uneasy truth remained: dismantling the network didn't erase the design behind it. If a single crash could unravel a web stretching from New York to Beijing, what other quiet systems were still running unseen, unchallenged, waiting for the next spark? The highways that once symbolized freedom now felt like front lines. Every passing semi-truck became a question mark, every license a potential breach. When the smoke cleared from Operation Twin Shield, America had dismantled a vast infiltration web, but also exposed a sobering reality. Its national arteries, the very veins of commerce and defense, had been quietly compromised from within. In late 2025, Reuters confirmed that over 1,000 fraudulent commercial licenses had been revoked. Yet intelligence briefings revealed something more chilling. The same logistical structures used to exploit trucking were appearing in other industries: port maintenance, agricultural shipping, even energy transport. What began as a scandal about licenses had evolved into a blueprint of influence, a method of embedding foreign leverage into the fabric of American life. President Trump, addressing the nation from the White House, declared this wasn't just corruption, it was infiltration, a deliberate campaign to turn our open systems against us. Behind him stood maps of U.S. transport hubs, overlaid with red dots marking compromised routes. The visual said it all: the battlefield had shifted from borders to back roads. Analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly warned that such influence operations mirrored China's global strategy, the same pattern seen in Belt and Road projects from Africa to Europe, where economic engagement masked dual-use control. DW noted that Russia, too, had used civilian transport firms to ferry military supplies across occupied zones in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Al Jazeera highlighted Israel's tightening of logistics security after uncovering Iranian shell companies managing regional trucking corridors. The parallels formed a single message: 21st century conflict wasn't just fought with missiles, but with cargo manifests, driver databases, and invisible contracts. For the United States, the balance between security and freedom had never been more fragile. Every new safeguard risked strangling the very liberty that defined its open economy. Civil rights groups warned of industrial profiling, while national security officials countered that unchecked access could be catastrophic. The debate split Congress, one side calling for tighter vetting, the other warning of a surveillance state creeping into every industry. Beyond the politics were the people: migrant drivers trapped between desperation and deception. Many had risked everything for opportunity, only to discover they were pawns in a geopolitical contest they didn't understand. Families torn apart, communities under suspicion, the human cost of global power games written on every mile marker. Globally, the ripple effects were unmistakable. In Europe, NATO transport security was reinforced amid fears of mirror operations. In Asia, Beijing denied all involvement, calling the US actions an excuse for anti-China hysteria. Yet intelligence from The Guardian and Reuters indicated that Beijing's United Front networks had quietly shut down several trade assistance programs, a broad silent acknowledgement of a network retreating into the shadows. As night fell over Washington, the question loomed larger than ever: had America truly dismantled the network or merely disrupted one branch of a much larger design? For now, the highways run, commerce flows, and freight still hums through the nation's veins. But behind the wheel, trust has changed forever. Every border check, every roadside inspection, every grant to a community nonprofit now carries the weight of a single question: who is really driving America forward? Operation Twin Shield began as a simple traffic investigation and ended as a wake-up call for an entire nation. What started with one fatal crash in Florida exposed a sprawling system of fraudulent licenses, foreign influence, and exploited migrants. Under President Trump's directive ICE, the FBI and DHS launched a tri-state enforcement campaign that uncovered connections between CCP-Linked nonprofits' U.S. grant funding and global influence networks. The investigation revealed that America's trucking industry, the backbone of its economy, had become a covert channel for infiltration. From fake DMV employees in Florida to pro-Beijing NGOs in New York, the operation traced a line of quiet manipulation stretching halfway across the world. By the end, hundreds were arrested, thousands of licenses revoked, and Washington forced to confront an uncomfortable truth: in the age of hybrid warfare, infiltration doesn't always arrive with weapons. Sometimes it arrives with a steering wheel. And the question remains, can a nation built on openness ever truly be secure without closing the doors that made it great?